My name is Charles Yeske, currently living in Doylestown, but I grew up in Lambertville, New Jersey, not far from historic Bucks County. My job is that of Historic Properties Manager for the Bucks County Parks and Recreation Department, in which I administer 3 historic sites. At one time, I actually administered the Durham mill when I first took the job, and we had it open for the public for about a 6-year period, and then it was sold back to Durham Township to be preserved as the historic site that it is. In 1975, I was president of the Tinicum Township Civic Association, and since then I've been involved in milling, preservation, research for the last 44 years almost. I'm currently president of the National Mill Society of 800 members, and also on the international board for an international milling group, and there I get to travel to Europe every year visiting old mills.
How does this one stack up against the other ones?
This one is good. It has, little areas of it that are, as I said, unique, and this one particularly because of the transitional history of it from its origins as being built on a historic Durham furnace, and then transitioning over the years from a simple grist mill and then to a flour mill, and then to what is called a commercial mill where other products were produced here and sold as well. And a lot of that was made possible by the addition to the original mill. The mills were what really brought a certain stability to and growth potential to this country, because previous to a place like this being built, the farmers and the farm families actually just ground their own grain with stones or a little mill called querns that turned around with the corn inside and just produced enough flour for themselves. But as the population increased, then it made it potentially a business opportunity, and so then the mills were built to handle the need for more flour being produced and more livestock feed being produced. So that's where the mills became very important. At one time in Bucks County alone, there were maybe 140 mills. Well, this mill, according to the records, was built in 1820, thereabouts, and it does represent mills of that period in its construction, and it contained, as best as I could see, all the early primitive milling processes that were necessary. The one unique feature of this mill and all the mills I visited is how long the race is, and the race was what conveyed the water from the creek by way of a dam and a gates all the way to the mill, and that being a mile long. So every day the miller would have to walk all the way to the top, open the gate, walk all the way back, making sure everything else was functioning properly, and fill up his the mill pond, and then at the end of the day walk back. The water came from Cook's Creek, and the supply was really important in the construction of the dam to make sure that the water was there when needed. All mills are located in what you might call a floodplain area because they have to be near water, so it has to be actually even lower than the dam supply. But it was that height of the water, whether it's 3 or 4 feet difference between the bottom of the race and when the water came in, that's what you were able to use to power your water wheel. You know how much water was coming in at a certain rate from the water wheel, then the hub of that was connected to the gearing that ran the millstones. The millstones, which were the heart of the earlier operation, the round stone with the hole in them, they operated by a pair, a top stone and a bottom stone. And it was the bottom stone was stationary and the top stone was connected to the gearing right off the water wheel. I believe there were 4 pair in this mill. The face where the bottom stone and the top stone circulated on top of each other, that was the facing that was ground and dressed, we call it. We'll put the lines in there to help with the cutting of the grain and the crushing of the grain and the conveyance of the flour and meal out of the millstone and then down to be bagged. But those stones were of different compositions. Some of them were a better grade than others. The more general ones were just field stones that were quarried out and made into circular shapes and then sized. The better ones were imported from France. They were called burr stones. And that's what you have here. And they came in segments and were put together like a puzzle and cemented together. But they produced a finer flour and a cleaner flour for some reason or other. The quality of those millstones then determined in some part the quality of the grain, the flour being produced from the grain. The mills often had a pair of stones that were particularly good for flour grinding, and then others just for the general corn grinding and livestock production. They varied from just a foot and a half across to up to 5 feet in diameter, and the bigger ones weigh up to like 2,400 pounds. They had to be taken apart periodically to be cleaned and sharpened, and there was a jack system that you used to lift the stones apart and clean them out. Eventually, as you sharpen them over the decades, they would lose their edge and they'd have to be reset a bit. But generally, they did last a long, long, long time. There was a lot of stones that were single pieces, except for the burr stones. And just from the stress of turning at maybe 70 revolutions per minute, that torque itself would weaken the stone and they would crack. And sometimes they would even explode. And when they would explode, they would take out the building. It would be like cannonballs being shot through your building. And oftentimes that was the case of the most serious injuries or death within the mill. Actually, people think about fires in the old mills because of the flour dust. There were actually more injuries and destruction from the exploding of the millstones and equipment failure than it was from fires from the dust. But that was one thing they did take precaution against, because flour dust is pretty combustible. So within the old mills particularly, you would find only wooden shovels and wooden scoops, wooden paddles being used. You didn't find anything metal-wise being used, because any chance of spark could potentially cause a fire. Here in the basement of and throughout the building here, the mills, on some of these beams you can see where the edging has like a special beading to it or cut. That's called a chamfering, and it's been determined that a fire coming in can more easily grasp and start to burn a post that is squared than one that is round or one that has this edging taken off. So that was one reason this decoration was used a lot, to shave down the corners of the post. Otherwise, the older mills had no electricity in them, so you didn't have to worry about that. But that became later on the reason for most fires, was the electricity that was installed. Being in a day without telephones and so forth, the mill had to be open. And when the farmer showed up, if the mill wasn't open, he'd go find the miller, he'd come over and start things up and get it running. Everything was grown locally and brought in, and the farmers would sometimes barter with the miller. The miller would take a portion of the grain before it was ground, or they would take a portion of the final product in terms of payment, and that's the way it went. It was a nice arrangement. No cash usually involved, at least through the early years. When the farmers would bring their grain to the mill, there may have been a weighing device outside the mill where the wagon would sit, and they could actually weigh the wagon before and afterwards and know how much they had used. Either way, it entered in the mill by means of a hoist system outside the back door, pulleyed up by the gearing that was connected to other machinery in the mill, to an upper area where then it was cleaned in a grain cleaner or separator. And this pertains to wheat as well and other products brought in. And that sifting device, the separator, would take out the sand or dirt, small pebbles, rocks, even bigger rocks, and then the sifted grain then would go through an elevator system down to the lower area where then it was ground by the millstones. After it went through the millstones, then it was conveyed back up to a sifting area, and after the sifting process then diverted to a barrel packing area or bag packing area. So that's a very simple way, and that could be done in a mill that's only a story and a half high or 3 stories high. All the gears are made of wood, and the spokes were wood, and up until the 1860s, 1900, that's when the things seemed to change over. When you had the wooden gears meshing, you had to do that very carefully because you didn't want a sudden startup because it would break the spokes or break the teeth of the gear. Of course, before the metal water wheels, they were all wooden, made of white oak, and they lasted several years, but again, would rot, and so the hubs and so forth would have to be replaced. So there was, of course, a wooden water wheel here before the current Fitz water wheel was put in. This mill seems to be a fair size one, being 3 stories and a basement. The higher the building, you could reason that they were busier and had needed the bins and so forth to store the raw grain or the flour for packing. So there was a lot of storage space here, and that was good for the miller because he could store the grain and then grind it a longer period of time than a small mill, which is dependent on the miller or the farmer just to bring in a bag of grain, and the simplest mills then he just carried it in and dumped it in the bin over top of the millstones. It wasn't even sifted or cleaned ahead of time in those times. For the size of the operation, once the warehouse was built in the 1920s, and the rail line brought in to deliver boxcar train loads of grain, probably supplying flour and feed for like the Bethlehem and other areas nearby. It was a big operation here. During that period of time, of course, this building was not built as a historic site. It was built as a business, and you had to adapt with machinery and things of that nature in order to survive. So as new machinery became available, you put that in, you were able to grind more efficiently, more often, and produce more stuff and have more revenue coming in. So a lot of mills, as you walk through them, as you do walk through this, there are bits and pieces of the oldest equipment here, and then there's some of the more modern equipment that was used up until the mill closed in the 60s. By observation and looking, you can tell which was the fairly old stuff and which is new and used more recently. For instance, on the top floor is the separator, which cleaned the grain. That piece of machinery dates from around 1860, thereabouts. And then one of the shifting reels probably is a little older than that. The millstones, of course, are not here anymore, but they were used, pretty continuously up until the 40s. But the newer equipment was machinery probably from the 40s that we see still here in the mill. The millstones were removed because you could make flour faster and cheaper with the belt and pulley powered mills, the attrition mill particularly. The attrition mill operated had some little millstones inside of it, so they still use the millstones, it's just not as big and in the same design feature as the originals. That was belt powered, and that did produce a lot of feed, a lot of flour, and a lot of the mills that I do see, they are still there and have been used. In fact, they can still be used. And because this mill then transitioned, a lot of its business was not so much the flour, which it was, but also the feed, livestock feed that was produced here with machinery called the hammer mill, which pulverized corn silage and other grains for animal feed. In the hammer mill, there are actually metal paddles almost, and they turn in the revolution of these paddles. That's what's hammering the grain, hammering the silage, chopping it up. It's more like a chopping mill than a hammer mill actually, and that's a substantial piece of equipment. And they're still used too. So yeah, that's the nice story about this building as it transitioned from simple corn meal to flour, and then to the other products that were ground here for consumption too by humans and livestock. But I know the livestock feed was continued until the Regals closed it down in the 60s there.
I'm Ron Fox. I grew up in Durham Township, and shortly after high school I started working here at the mill. I started when I was 20, probably in the mid-60s, and I think I was here maybe 3 or 4 years. My parents built a home. They built a home down here on 212. So yes, I grew up here. But when I started working here, I would drive out to work every morning. The mill was actually in decline when I was here. There was a lot of stuff that was gone already. And shortly after I left the mill, it was closed. And that was probably mid-60s. I can tell you this, when I first started working here at the mill, Tuesday was delivery day to all the smaller customers, and it would be a bag of chicken feed here, a bag of dog food here, that kind of thing. It was the large truck with a full load, take me all day to make my run. And when I left, we were down to a 3/4 ton pickup truck, and I could do it in a half a day. So the business had really declined rapidly. There was only 2 of us. It was, well, actually 3 with Mr. Riggle. But old Raymond Stover, myself, and Mr. Riggle. That was it. 3 people. Mr. Riggle lived right across the street. I lived probably a mile towards the river. I lived at home with my parents. And Raymond Stover lived in Kittnersville. When Mr. Riggle offered me the job and he told me $1.25 an hour, I thought it was in 7th heaven. That was a lot of money then.
The owner was Mr. Riggle?
Yes, it was. He treated me fine. He treated Mr. Stover fine. I mean, yeah, he could be pretty gruff at times, but I can't say that he ever did anything to hurt me. I always felt he was fair. The raw materials were brought into the mill for, I'll use the dairy industry for example. I would usually take feed out, deliver it to the farm, and then load up corn and bring it back into the mill for next week's delivery. So it was an ongoing thing. And we had numerous dairy farms in Durham, Williams, Springfield, and throughout the years, I mean, they're all gone, all but one. I can only think of one, and that's the only one left in Durham Township. I can remember that Mr. Riggle was on vacation one time, so now it was just Raymond and I for that week, a couple days, whatever it was that he was gone. And we always ground the corn with electric powered hammer mill, which sits over there on the floor yet. And we always had to wheel the corn. We'd pull the truck up to the door and fill the wheelbarrow, run the wheelbarrow in, dump it in the hammer mill. And I was farming also at the time. And I had a little elevator, and when he was gone, I brought it out here, and it made it so much easier to unload the trucks. So when he came back, Raymond Stover told him how good that worked, and he called me in the office, and he had a catalog there. He said, "Which one would you like?" So he bought one, and I don't know ever what happened to it, but it's not around here anymore, so he must have sold it after I left, or when he shut the mill down. But yes, that did save time, made it much easier to unload the trucks, because you didn't have to wheel the wheelbarrows in and dump them, go back out, fill them up, wheel them in. You just set the elevator up and just pushed it right into the elevator. I can't say that I can remember any major problems we had, although I was not in the mill most of the time. Most of the time I was on the road as a driver salesman, and I would bring stuff in, take it out, deliver it. I'd have to go on longer trips. Maybe I'd have to go to Wilmington, Delaware to pick up supplies. And towards the end, Purina had put a new factory in Camp Hill. So then I started hauling out of Camp Hill. And that was usually at least once a month, sometimes twice a month. We'd get railroad cars in over in Wrigglesville, New Jersey. Raymond would help me unload them, because usually we were waiting for material, and it was like, we need it right now. And then we'd run short, and then I'd have to either go to Wilmington or Camp Hill. Most of the farms I serviced once a week, but there was numerous farms. Sometimes I would go out with 2 loads a day, maybe some days only 1 load, but it always kept you busy. There were some farms that I enjoyed going to. There was others that I wasn't real happy to go to. Most of them, though, I was very glad to go to them. I can remember the Pector farm. Maybe Louis was unloading hay when I got there, so I couldn't get in to dump the feed. So I would help him unload the hay. Then he'd help me unload the feed, and then he'd say, "Let's go down to the spring house." Well, down in the spring house, he always had ice cold beer. So we'd have a bottle of beer before I came back. Maybe that wasn't very kosher, but the Bandy farm, there was another one. That lady always was a terrific baker, and usually she always had baked goods when I got there. A lot of the farms, if you got there at lunchtime or they were taking a break, you were invited to partake with them. And there was others, well, you were there just to deliver the feed, and I'll be on your way. You were always busy. I mean, you really didn't have any downtime per se, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. Kept me in shape. Today I probably couldn't do what I used to do. And in fact, I know I can't do what I used to do. On the other hand, I didn't work full time either. When school was in, I drove school bus. And then I only worked from 9 until like 2:30 in the afternoon. And Mr. Riggle was fine with that. That was a stipulation when he hired me, that I was getting my school bus driver's license, so I wasn't going to be able to be here full time. Although during the summer months it was different. Then I worked all day long. During the summer months, you had harvest time. Some of the farmers would be bringing grain in, and we would store it here at the mill. Small grains, not corn, but small grains. Barley, not so much wheat. Wheat we'd haul to Philadelphia, to the docks, which that was one part of the job I didn't like. I didn't like going to Philadelphia with a load of wheat. It took forever to get unloaded, and to me it was a waste of time, but I was getting paid by the hour to sit there in a truck and wait, but I didn't like it.
Is it similar to when you last saw it, or are a lot of things different inside the mill?
It hasn't changed. It's as if I walked out yesterday. There are some things that have changed. A lot of people can't remember that there was a little area up on the first floor that he sold hardware, miscellaneous products like fly spray, that sort of thing, little things. And that was in a small area upstairs with a big glass front that you could look in, because let's face it, the mill was very dusty, so that area was always kept clean. And it was supplies that the general public could use, but I don't know if it really made a lot of extra money. It was just a matter of supplying things that were needed on most farms. I would love to see the wheel turn. Like I said, I did have it turning. And we worked very hard. Joe Shavar and I worked very hard to get the water into the mill. Being as we don't get water from Cooks Creek, the only water that's available to run the wheel comes down Coon Hollow. But first of all, the gate across the road would have to be fixed. The other possibility would be to hook up an electric motor to the wheel so you could have it turning and just have some water running in over it to make it look like it was doing its job. When I think back, they were some good years that I spent here. I wasn't here that many years, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. Every other week, my grandparents, who lived in Williams Township, would get chicken feed. And I always made sure that I stopped there at lunchtime because my grandma always had fresh pie for me. So that was a highlight for me. When my wife would come into the mill to get dog food or whatever, Mr. Riggle would say, "Oh, your girlfriend's here." Well, I guess that's how I met my wife. Her and I have been married for 51 years. But yeah, she always made a point of coming to the mill for dog food. She could have got it somewhere else, but she always came here to get it. If something ever happened to this, it'd be gone forever. And it's just hard for me to explain, but I like the old mill. And, it was here from the time I was a little boy. There's a lot of fond memories of the old mill. History. I guess it's just the history that I love so much.